Hello and welcome to Crimes Through Time, weekly snapshots of crime history. Amy Stuart was born in Sunderland on the 12th of November 1893 to James Stuart, a ship's captain, and Jane Nee McGregor. She had one sister, Edith, and a younger brother, James Stuart. As a teen, she developed a passion for dancing and had aspirations to perform in the music halls and West End theatres. Age 15, with the full support of her parents, she left home to join a touring troupe called the Magnets as a chorus girl. She adopted the name Mamie. Later she would form her own troupe, the Five Verona Girls. They were a popular attraction that toured worldwide. They turned quite a few heads, daring to expose their legs right up to the knee. She was an attractive woman with brown bobbed hair and grey-blue eyes. By early 1917, the Five Verona Girls came to an end. One lady got pregnant, another broke her ankle. So Mamie returned home to her family in Sunderland. It would be later that year in July she would meet and ultimately fall in love with James Shotton. He was a marine engineer 14 years her senior. He told her he was a widower. It was a whirlwind romance, and within months he had bought a diamond ring. On the 25th of March 1918 in South Shields they tied the knot. The newlyweds honeymooned in Droitwich Spa. They first settled in Bristol before moving to Swansea, living in Trafalgar Terrace for 6 months. But then in late summer 1919 they moved to Caswell, renting a remote cottage overlooking Swansea Bay called Tai Lamwyd. Throughout this time, Mamie was in frequent contact with her family, still in Sunderland. But George was not the man he seemed. His first wife, who he had married in December 1909, Mary Shotton, was very much still alive. She lived just 2 miles away in Penarth with their 3-year-old son, Arthur. She believed it was George's work that had kept him away from home for extended periods of time. In truth, I think she was glad he was away. She would later testify he was an angry and violent man who would often beat her. Mamie was last seen in November or early December 1919. Letters sent in the months prior to her disappearance showed the marriage was an unhappy one. George was now being violent with Mamie and preventing her from resuming her career on the stage. She was planning to leave him. Her last letter from Tai Lamwyd to her parents was dated the 12th of November 1919. They replied, but the letter returned marked "House closed." They assumed it was a mistake and sent a reply by paid telegram from the post office. But the telegram was also returned "House closed." Shortly before Christmas 1919, they would receive a strangely worded telegram, supposedly from Mamie, wishing them, quote, "compliments of the season." It was the last they would hear from Mamie or George. In March 1920, a leather trunk was left by a male guest in Swansea's Grosvenor Hotel. It had been left unclaimed for 3 months, so the manager contacted the police. This was just procedure. It covered the hotel from claims of theft if they themselves opened the luggage. Once inside, the officers found 2 women's dresses and a pair of shoes that had been torn and cut up. There was also jewellery, a Bible, a rosary, and a manicure set, but also a scrap of paper. On it was Mamie's parents' address. When they were contacted, they reported Mamie missing, telling them they had been actively trying to locate her for months. They handed over her letters documenting her unhappiness and the growing violence in the relationship, plus more they had collected from friends of Mamie. In one she wrote, quote, "If you don't hear from me, please wire to Mrs. Hearn and see if she knows anything about me. The man is not all there. I don't think I'm going to live with him much longer. My life is not worth living." The police shared her parents' fears for Mamie's safety. Around the same time, a maid was cleaning the rental house at Tai Lamwyd, ready for new tenants. She found Mamie's mildewed brown leather handbag, concealed behind a dresser in an upstairs bedroom. It contained all her personal effects, including £2 in loose change and her sugar ration card. By spring 1920, South Wales police were convinced Mamie had been murdered by George, but they just couldn't prove it. The case was turned over to Scotland Yard, and Chief Inspector William Draper travelled to Wales to oversee the investigation. He ordered a detailed search of Tylanwyd, the grounds and all surrounding terrain, but no sign of Mamie was found. A nationwide search was then commenced. Her description was circulated in the press all throughout Britain. Again, no sign of Mamie was found. Draper quickly found George. He was back living with Mary and Arthur in Penarth. He admitted to knowing Mamie and to leaving her trunk in the hotel. He stated that he did that following an argument they had in early December 1919, after he had discovered that she had been unfaithful. He was adamant he had not married Mamie, and he had no idea where she was now. Records contradicted his story, and it was proven he had bigamously married Mamie 2 years prior. Detectives also visited Mrs. Hearn, her friend, who confirmed Mamie had reported having been beaten by George and had once begged her, quote, "If I am ever missing, do your utmost to find me, won't you?" The police were left with a dilemma. The law at the time required a body to charge someone with murder, and it was like Mamie truly had vanished. They knew George had killed her, but could do nothing about it. They began to refer to it as, quote, the perfect crime. So they did the only thing they could do. They charged him with bigamy. He was arrested on the 29th of May 1920, and he went to trial at Glamorgan Assizes 2 months later. He pled not guilty. His defence? Yes, he lived with Mamie and had let those who know them believe they were married. However, someone had assumed his identity to marry her, like she would have noticed a different man at the altar. Many witnesses took to the stand to testify that the marriage was legal and valid, including Edith, Mamie's sister, saying George would call Mamie, quote, my own little wife, and sign his letters, your own loving husband. Sir Ellis Griffiths, KC, appeared for the prosecution, and he openly accused George of, quote, doing away with her. He denied even mistreating her, stating that they had argued and parted ways in December 1919, and that was the last he knew of her. On the 13th of July 1920, George was found guilty and sentenced to 18 months with hard labour for bigamously marrying Mamie. Now we fast forward 42 years to the 5th of November 1961. 3 potholers, Graham Jones, John Girk and Chris McNamara, were exploring a disused lead mine in Brandy Cove near Caswell. About 50 feet down their path, they were blocked by a large stone slab. Pulling the stone aside, John discovered a skull. He rotated it to face him and realised it was human. Nearby lay a black celluloid hair clip, pieces of jewellery including a 7-inch brass chain, and several scraps of clothing. The remains and the rotting sack in which they had been hidden was taken to the Forensic Science Laboratory in Cardiff, where they were examined by Home Office pathologists William James and John Griffith. The bones were reassembled into a complete skeleton, minus the rib cage, belonging to a female between 5'3" and 5'4" tall, and with 1 canine tooth extracted from the upper jaw. 3 of her wisdom teeth were present, suggesting she was over 20 years old. An X-ray study of the growth area of her bones revealed she was fully mature, but the complete maturation had only recently occurred. The 2 bones at the base of her skull had only recently fused, suggesting that she was mid-20s and unlikely to be over 28. Sections of the skeleton had been stained green due to the copper contamination from the brass jewellery. No precise cause of death could be determined. Even though the body was completely skeletonized, the location and general description matched that of 26-year-old Mamie Stuart. The jewellery and scraps of clothes and footwear were sent to the National Museum of Wales. They confirmed the gilt copper stole tassels were most fashionable around 1920. The most recent year of manufacture of the gold wedding ring and diamond engagement ring were found to be 1912 and 1918 respectively, indicating the woman had died soon after World War I. Mrs. Hearn, now an elderly lady, was able to identify the rings as those belonging to Mamie. So what had George been up to in the intervening years? He was released from prison in early 1922 and promptly divorced by his legal wife Mary. He re-established his life in Tinton, where he ran a small holding. He was remembered as a charming chap, regular churchgoer, deeply involved with the tennis club. He lived quietly there for many years until a local newspaper published the story of Mamie's disappearance and how George was suspected of being involved. He promptly dropped everything and moved. He chose to return home to live with his mother Louisa in Balham, South London, where he made ends meet by taking odd jobs. In May 1938, he was arrested for threatening his sister Gladys Austin with a gun at her home in Fareham. He was charged with actual bodily harm against her. The siblings had been arguing over their respective inheritance from their mother, George being deeply resentful of his sister. He was sentenced to 12 months prison with hard labour. Upon release, he cut all contact with family and friends and moved to Ledbury, finding work at an aircraft factory. He would finally settle in Bristol. In 1961, police with Interpol set out to find George. 9 men were assigned full-time to this task. It took 3 weeks. Unfortunately, he was found in Bristol's Arnos Vale Cemetery. He had died of natural causes 3 years previous, on the 30th of April 1958, aged 77. He was penniless and spent his last years in Bristol's Southmead Hospital following a stroke. He was buried in a pauper's grave marked only with his welfare number. However, Mary Shotton, his first wife, was still very much alive. She felt able to speak more freely about George's treatment of her. He was a man with a temper, who had been violent with her on many occasions. Following the divorce, she saw very little of him through the years. She disclosed the reason she divorced him. Partly was because of the bigamy, of course, but also she was convinced that he was responsible for Mamie's disappearance. She was sure he had killed her. A formal inquest into Mamie's death was held on the 14th of December 1961. Throughout the proceedings, her skeleton was laid on a table in the well of the courtroom. Forensic testimony revealed that the body had been cut at 3 equal lengths using a hacksaw. One had been made at the lower femur just above the knees, a second a horizontal cut made through both humerus bones at midsection, and third severing the lower shoulder blades and her spine. The murderer was not skilled at dissection, and there were many striations and indentations showing unsuccessful attempts to sever the bones. No rib bones were ever recovered from the disposal site. Formal identification was made by experts superimposing a photograph of the skull over a smiling life-size portrait of Mamie, taken in her days on the stage. The missing tooth also matched the tooth it was known that Mamie had lost. The coroner, D.R. James, testified that other than ruling out trauma to the skull, he was unable to give a precise cause of death as no soft tissue remained. But he did rule the manner of death as murder, asking the jury, quote, "Can you imagine any reason for sawing up anyone if the person had committed suicide or if the death was accidental?" An interesting witness was William Simmons. In December 1919, he was the postman delivering to Tylanwyd, where George and Mamie lived. He saw George struggling with a large sack. He was loading it into a small yellow van which was parked outside the front gate. He had offered to give George a hand, but George seemed to panic before replying, "No, no, no. Oh God, you gave me a fright. For a minute I thought you were a policeman." At the time, the postman had blue uniforms that at a glance could be mistaken for that of a constable. George would drive away in the direction of Brandy Cove. On the 15th of December 1961, it was concluded that the remains found were those of Mamie Stuart. Although an exact cause of death could not be determined, it was concluded that she had been murdered between the 12th of November and the 6th of December 1919, and that George Shotton was responsible for her murder. Following the inquest, Mamie's skeleton was retained by Cardiff University. No effort was made to trace her family and return her body. Instead, she was used as a teaching aid by famous pathologist Bernard Knight. It would be researchers from the CBS reality channel that would trace Mamie's great-niece, Susie Aldnell, in 2019 during production of a series focusing on unsolved murders. Susie would find Mamie stored inside a cupboard in a Cardiff forensic laboratory. The senior forensic pathologist at the lab, Dr. Stephen Ledbetter, had retained the remains despite an order to dispose of them in case a relative were to claim them. When Stephen heard that Susie had been traced, he personally returned Mamie to her in order that she be buried with her family. In December 2019, 100 years after her death, Mamie was finally reunited with her parents and laid to rest in Bishwearmouth Cemetery in Sunderland, in a ceremony attended by 4 of her relatives. Susie would make the following comment to the BBC, quote, "She's been treated with such a lack of dignity, and now she's with her parents. I'm not religious, but I do feel much better about it now. I only did what a lot of people would have done, and I hope if there is a heaven, that the family now all finally together are having a good time." Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you think of this case in the comments below, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.